Welcome to Guided by Third Wheel, the podcast. My name is Amber Ireland, and I'm here with my co-host, Jill Bucaro. Let's get started.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Guided by Third Wheel. When we ended our last podcast, we had the bright idea to talk a little bit about some self-help books. I don't know if I would call them all self-help, but some books that have really helped both Amber and I just on our journey around self-care, self-discovery, things like that. So I have compiled a wild little list here in my journal. The first thing I've learned is that I have read 1,000,000,000,000,000 self-help books. So we are certainly not going to go through all of them, but I know for me, and Amber, you probably get this too, I get a lot of people reach out to me that are like, I kind of want to start being more intentional about working through some of my shit, making my self-care practices better. And a lot of people ask me, what book should I read? And I think there's some books, and that's what we're going to start with, that everybody should read. I think that there are certain books out there that every single human being on this planet would benefit from. But then I think there's certain subsets of books that are better for people depending on what they're struggling with, right? Is it trauma? Is it anxiety? Is it relationship attachment or trauma from that, all of those different types of things. I think there's a great subset of books for people who are social workers or working in the social service field. So we'll try to hit some of those different categories at the end. At first I had this beautiful idea that we would link all the books, but that's never going to happen because I have 37 on this list. So I'm going to try to be really mindful while we go through about naming the name of the book and the author. So you guys can pause, write that down, and hit Amazon, Google, wherever you get your books. So maybe get a pen and paper. I don't know. But we'll get started.
Yeah. Do we want to talk first just kind of about sometimes the stigma around a self-help book, especially in the social service field, especially when you have a license and you've been taught all of these things. And it's a self-help book is not for you because it is too, basic.
Pop psychology, not rooted in theory or evidence-based practice. Yes. And I think particularly for us social workers who have been through master's programs or clinical master's programs, there's a lot of stigma around self-help. I literally had a professor tell me self-help books are for bartenders and hairstylists, right? It's cheap advice, essentially, is what they said, which number one is classist and gross. And number two is just bullshit. I just don't believe it. Do I base a lot of my clinical practice in evidence-based, practices and modalities? Yes. But do I also use a lot of the concepts and ideas and things that I've gotten from self-help books? Yes, I have. I think we need to have a variety of diverse tools in our toolbox. And I think self-help is really good. And a lot of these books are written by doctors and professors and clinical psychologists, right? And people who have been in the field for a really long time. So, I used to kind of believe that or be nervous or I'd be embarrassed, right? That I was reading a self-help book, but I just don't feel that way anymore.
No.
And I think that I have personally experienced a lot of growth and come to a lot of revelations because of some of the stuff that I've read.
Yeah. And I think, too, we think of, if you think about self-help books and you're it's coming from all these different people, how much do they really know? This isn't evidence-based, blah, blah, blah. But, we walk around the world all the time and we observe things and we hear things from other people and people that we trust. And, that's not all evidence-based. That's not all by some, doctor that's got, 40 years of experience. Yep. That's our own personal experience. And we take what we need from that to help ourselves move forward. And I think it is the same thing with self-help books, listening to podcasts, reading all different types of text. It's you may read something the way someone says it that really inspires you to go deeper, to really reflect upon your own life, and reflect upon things that maybe you want to have different in your life that you wouldn't have gotten out of some type of scholarly text.
Absolutely. No, I think that's so true. And we even have a space for that in the social work field that's called practice wisdom, right? Which is using your experience, the experience of the people who have been in the game longer than you to inform your interventions and your practice with clients. So, yes, I'm with you 100%. And I just think sometimes, like, to your point, the scholarly articles in the journals, they can be really hard to digest sometimes.
Right.
And, books, these self-help books that are like made for both clinicians and, other people, just regular, everyday people, are going to be a lot easier to digest.
Right.
And what's also interesting, I think, is we're going to run through a bunch of these, but so many of them say the same thing. Like, it reminds me of, like, when we think about, like, spirituality and God and religious texts, and it all boils down to the same shit every single time. Right. But to your point, we need to try different things so it hits us the way it needs to hit us, right? So we can access it in the moment. So yeah, a lot of this, I mean, probably if you read 5 of these 37, you'd be good to go, right? Because I do notice the more that I read, I'm like, oh, it's saying the same shit over and over again. But sometimes shit I need to hear over and over again for it to click.
And in a lot of different ways and from a lot of different perspectives. And, and we think about just, when we're talking about, like, the social service field, everyone hits hard on the fact that, like, the only way that you are going to help or provide influence to someone is to build a relationship with them, for them to have that connection with you. And so it is the same way in text. Like, if I find an author that I feel connected to, I am more likely to be able to take what they're saying and internalize it than I am with somebody that I'm not connected to.
Absolutely. And I know for me, there's certain, like, kind of self-help gurus that I follow, that I read their books, I, listen to their podcasts, because I just, that what they say resonates with me and my experience, right? And then I talk to, people, my friends, and they're like, oh no, I don't really like her, or she rubs me the wrong way. But to your point, you find something that clicks.
Yeah.
Okay. The other point that we wanted to make before we got into our list is, we talked about this in the last podcast too, that sometimes, like, you just need to hear something so you don't unhear it again.
Right.
And that's how I feel like a lot of these self-help books are. It just challenges you to think about your life, think about your experience in a different way. And then once you get that little inkling, once you get that little nugget of knowledge, you can't unthink it, right? Your mind has expanded, right? You are able to view that situation in a different way. And so that's why I also think it's important to kind of read some of this stuff and go on these journeys of self-discovery.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, to your point of not being able to unhear it and to, be able to look at things from different perspectives, I've also found that there have been some self-help type of books that I have read that I have found to be absolute bullshit. And I get into it and I'm like, this is crazy. Like, this person is wild. And there is no way that I am going to use what is in this book, because, like, this person is, how they're writing things is very elitist. It's very sexist. It's very gender biased. And, but I always recognize that, like, oh, okay. Well, that was a learning opportunity for me too. Yeah. Right. That was a way for me to recognize something about the way that the world is working around me, whether I like it or not.
This is, some people believe this. Some people think this. Some people subscribe to this. Not what I subscribe to, but good to know.
Good to know, yeah. Because as I talk to other people in the world who are not me, and I have to recognize that everyone is not me as much as I would like them to be, make my life a lot easier. But I can then have a broader understanding when I am presented with people who don't think the same way that I do. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there is definitely value in that as well. And it's still, even if you don't agree, it's still expanding your mind, right? You're still hearing different perspectives, which is important. Okay. So, by Jill and Amber, in no particular order.
Yes.
Books that I think everybody in the whole wide world should read. So my first one is probably an unpopular opinion among some people, but the first one I wrote down is AANA, or 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. So I am not in recovery. I'm not. But I think, one, for social workers, you need to read these books. And two, for someone, and we'll get into this later too, that has, I just think, I don't know if I want to call it trauma, confusion, some unsettled kind of feelings around religion. I think the way that AANA and 12 Steps and 12 Traditions kind of outline spirituality, reliance on a higher power, I think it's a really unique perspective. And it's not necessarily religiously coded, right, in the way that some religious texts are. And I think it's a nice foundation in trust, in relinquishing control, and, understanding that the universe will unfold as it should, and letting go, right, of some of that managing and controlling behavior. So that was on my list. One that we talked about too, Amber, that kind of, I think, fits into that category. And when you think historically about like traditional self-help books, that term was kind of coined by the AANA movement. And the other book that falls in there is Codependent No More,
right,
which I know you've read that one as well. That's Melody Beattie. I think that's a very good book for everyone to read. As well, because I think many of us, particularly those of you that are listening that are in the helping professions, probably would see in that book some behaviors and compulsions and mindsets that kind of fall into that codependent category.
And honestly, like, even if you're like, I have never been codependent in my entire life. I don't think that is me at all. Read the book. Because I have a feeling that you will find aspects in there that you're like, oh, I didn't even really consider that. And does that mean like you get in there and you read it and you're like, oh, that I do that, or that has happened, and does that mean I'm codependent? No, it doesn't. I mean, you don't have to like diagnose yourself or something crazy. Like, it's just something to witness and be like, oh, okay, maybe I just need to watch that. Right? Maybe I just need to watch and see, like, how does that change the way that I'm in relationship with other people? How does that make me feel when I'm in relationship with people and I have that behavior or I have that thought process, right? Like, things that we may have never really honed in on.
Yes. And I think it's kind of a foundational text for boundary setting.
Absolutely.
And, we talk a lot about boundaries and the relationship between boundaries and self-care. And I think that Codependent No More, like AA, like NA, these are what I would call like foundational kind of like starting to round out your spirituality and your self-care kind of practices. And even if people are not codependent, which shout out to the people out there who are not codependent, jealous of you, certainly we're all going to experience relationships where there is enmeshment and there are poor boundaries. And I think Codependent No More is useful for that. So I had those ones on my list.
I think too, what was the name of the one I gave you? I am not a fantastic book reporter as Jill is, but the Dodging Energy Vampires.
Okay.
I think that really is a good book around boundaries as well. That's by, what do we say?
Christiane Northrup.
Okay.
Dodging Energy Vampires.
Dodging Energy Vampires. And, really, I already knew that there were people in my life that were kind of like energy vampires, right? And when we talk about energy vampires, we're talking about those people in your life that really, like, you get around them, and when you are finished talking to them, or you're finished interacting, or even while you're interacting, you're like, God, it just feels like you are just depleting every last bit of energy that I have, right? They're the people that want you to do things for them. They want to like dump all of their shit on you and and tell you all of the things, and then almost expect you to fix it. They like sit in like the woe is me victim mode, and they they call you about just literally everything,
Yes.
like to attend to them. Like, oh my gosh, I'm having this going on, attend to me, right? And so it really is a good book to identify that and see all of the different ways, because some of it is kind of like, there were things that I like knew, right? Like I knew certain people were doing that.
Sure.
And then as I read the book, I'm like, oh my gosh, they were doing that like on a very like low level that I wasn't even registering to
But
me.
it was still sucking the
But
energy.
it was still happening, right?
Yes.
And and so it teaches you how to recognize it. And I think once you can recognize that happening, it becomes a lot easier to draw the boundary, right? Because you know what you're drawing a boundary to. Because, that like energy vampire stuff, it's just, it's partly codependent.
Yes,
right?
I
It's
think
a
it
partly
definitely
codependent-
falls in that bucket. Mm-hmm.
Right. But also, you have to be able to see it. Like,
Right, and
sometimes
again,
it's hard.
And I think sometimes like that book gives you the verbiage and the words to articulate what is happening. In your gut, this is not healthy, right? But then the book gives you the ability to name it. My cousin, who is very wise, she always says we can only solve our problems as quickly as we can identify them.
Right.
And it allows you to identify what's going on there. So I think that would be another good foundational one.
Yeah.
I think that Brené Brown is a great place to start for foundational kind of self-exploration, self-care type of books. The two books I typically recommend by Brené Brown to start out with are either Gifts of Imperfection or Daring Greatly. And this is where I do like the really terrible thing and like the not accurate thing of kind of dividing people into two buckets, right? I think there are some people, and I fall into this bucket, that are super high performing, super perfectionistic, always hustling for validation, always hustling for worthiness. Think that if you mess something up, you are not, deserving of love and belonging and all of those types of things. And for people like that, I think Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown is where you need to start. For people who maybe are still high performing but have like a lot of fear, have a lot of maybe some imposter syndrome, feel themselves like always gearing up but never really making a lot of progress towards their goals, for people that are feeling stuck, I would recommend Daring Greatly. So that's kind of like the distinction I make there. Yeah. And I am one of the most like high performing perfectionistic people I know. And I still got a ton out of Daring Greatly. Let me say that. I think they're both good. And it's just, again, super foundational. The Gifts of Imperfection, I probably have like a little special connection to that one. That's the first like kind of self-helpy book I ever read. And I tell this story a lot because I think it just shows how profound just like expanding how you think about things is. I opened Gifts of Imperfection. I read the first, I don't even think I got to the actual book. I think I was reading like the foreword by Brené, and I shut the book and I was like, I need to end the relationship I'm in. Like that's how profound it was. Like it just shined a light on things that I was just unwilling to admit, unwilling to look at, unwilling to see. And I think, again, it speaks to that. Like, we need to continually do things to broaden our perspective of what's going on in our life.
Right. And also, you talk about, like, two buckets of people and, for these two different books. But also recognizing that, like you said, the other book was also extremely helpful to you.
Sure.
And knowing that both of those characteristics can lie within you at the same time.
Yes.
It's not an either or. Like you can be extremely high functioning, and also you are functioning, and there are things that you're not getting to because of that fear.
You're
like
feeling you're paralyzed a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think both of those things are true, but some people don't want to read 37 books like me, right?
Yeah. Well,
so they're like, let me pick one, Jill.
And
I'm like,
also,
read them all.
Right.
Ideally, you would all read them all, but.
Yeah. But, here's the thing, whatever book that you pick up to read because you're like, I heard this podcast or I've heard this from a friend or whatever, trust that you're going to get what you need out of it. Because that's what's going to happen.
Yes. The universe, I believe, will direct you to the book that you need.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Or the person that you need, or the podcast that you need, or the little TikTok video that you need to hear at that time.
Yes.
That kind of sparks that inspiration in you to be like, oh, I need to look at this a little closer. Right? Or I need to make this change here. And that's how we get our pivots. I mean,
Absolutely.
that's how we get the inspiration for our pivots.
Yes, what we need gets dropped into our path for sure. The next ones, I'm going to name 3 books all at once because I think they all basically say the same thing. They've all been recommended to me, and I would call them more spiritual kind of books. I think a lot of them are rooted in what we would maybe categorize as kind of like Buddhist. Theology is the wrong word, like Buddhist theory. Thank you, Amber. Where it's a lot about like understanding that like life is fleeting. We can't get too attached, right? We need to find like the self within us that is able to observe what's going on, right? We don't need to get caught up in the sea of emotion. We need to like really boil it down to the us on the inside, right? That's able to just observe, be curious,
right,
and take on that information to move forward. I think all 3 of these books are phenomenal, and I think they literally all say the exact same thing. And I'll tell you I can give a little bit more distinction. So the first one is The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. That's a pretty popular book. I imagine people have heard of that one. Another one is called The 4 Agreements, which is like based on some kind of like, I think it's from Central America, like some real ancient kind of wisdom and spirituality. And I forgot to write down the author of that. Oopsie
I feel
doodles.
like I have read that one too. Let me look.
So the 4 Agreements is very short. So if you don't like to read, of the 3, I would pick the 4 Agreements because it's itty bitty. So Amber will look up the author of 4 Agreements. Like I said, Untethered Soul by Michael Singer and A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. And he's written a couple of books as well.
I do like Eckhart Tolle.
Yes, with those same kind of...
But be ready when you read an Eckhart Tolle book or listen to one, because sometimes it is just like a little mind fuck.
It is a bit of a mind fuck. And I would put these in order from like easiest to toughest read. Easiest read and quickest read would be 4 Agreements.
Yes.
Next up would be Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, and that is my favorite of the 3. That one resonated with me the most. And to Amber's point, Eckhart Tolle is a little bit headier. I think he goes a little bit deeper. And so his was a longer read, but perhaps a bit of a deeper read. But yeah, I would rank them kind of in that order from like least to most aggressive. But I mean, the 4 Agreements it's small, but man, is it packed with fucking like meaning and stuff like that. Who's the author?
Don Miguel Ruiz.
Okay. Perfect. And it's a little book, like the 4 Agreements, like a little pocket book. It's a good one. And I think that's kind of my final like foundational book. I would read a Brene Brown. I would read one of these kind of spiritual books. I would think about some kind of 12-steppy, whether it's Codependent No More, AA or NA, or 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. And I would start there. That's what I would tell everybody. Pick one of those and kind of see what resonates, see what hits, and keep it moving.
Yes. And also, if you have read a book about the Eightfold Path, the Buddhist Eightfold Path, I think it's Eightfold. I have not. However, like 1,000 people have brought that up to me.
Yes.
And I keep saying, like, I need to read a book.
We'll put that one on
that
our
is
list
on
to
my
read.
list of things to do before the end of the year, because as I, if you explore into also, and I don't remember the names of the books, but there are a few Reiki books out there on, if you look for the ones that are authored by Franz Stein, they are part of the Usui tradition of Reiki. And you can find a lot of things in there that kind of go along with that Eightfold Path. It is not a Buddhist type of a book, but the kind of the concepts around like the Reiki precepts and things like that can sometimes be helpful we just did this in our energy retreat, but around grounding and self-help in those areas, and just things that you can say to yourself, like mantra type work, where you can remind yourself of kind of like who you are and what you have to do every day. Like, so for today, I don't have to worry. I get to make a choice on how my life moves forward in the journey that I'm on. But also I can relinquish some control there because I can choose not to engage in some of those more controlling behaviors.
Right. And what's so interesting to hear you say that is like, in having done the work that I've done, the Reiki precepts align almost perfectly with AA, align almost perfectly with the stuff that's in the 4 agreements and the untethered soul. And that's where it's kind of what I was talking about. It's just like, where do we want to access?
Right.
What makes the most sense for our life and our experience and our perspective to access this wisdom?
Right.
Because I think a lot of it is really, really similar. Okay. I wrote down, I think maybe we should go here next. I wrote down a couple books, and Amber has one, that are good books just for like quick and dirty, every single day, like read something short. So like what we think about, like there's a lot of like religious texts that have devotionals, like just a short little message to kind of get your day going. Part of my self-care practice, every morning I read either, 5 to 7 pages of a self-help book, or right now I have like, I'm reading a book called The Pivot Year by Brianna Wiest. And it's just 365 little, meditations, devotionals, whatever you want to call it, right? Like 3 or 4 paragraphs with an idea. It takes you about 90 seconds to read. It hits you hard. It makes you engage in some reflection, and then off you go. So I wrote down a couple of those. Brianna Wiest, Wiest, I think I'm saying her name right. She just, has a lot of really, I think really thoughtful meditations, at least that really resonate for me. So her newest book is The Pivot Year, and it's 365 of these meditations. I started it in June. I'm cruising through. I read it every morning. She also wrote the book, 1,000 Essays to Change the Way You Think. So these essays they're not long, but they're longer than the ones in The Pivot Year. Anywhere between like 2 to 5 pages, I would say. And you could, in theory, read one of these essays each morning. Amber wrote down...
It's the Complete Notes from the Universe. And who
wrote it?
Over there?
Mike Dooley.
Yeah. And that's a nice book. I call it, it's, obviously it's not a Bible, but I call it Bible dipping. Actually, that came from another book called Running with Scissors, where the dad was, I think it's a fiction book. It might be nonfiction. I don't know. I read a long time ago, but I really liked it. I think there was a movie about it, but he called it Bible dipping. Like anytime that the family needed like some guidance or a message, he would like open up the Bible and put his finger and then read that. So, the Complete Notes of the Universe, you could do it front to back, and it's kind of like it's like what you said, where it's a brief, quote, like an inspirational quote or a little paragraph that is, uplifting or makes you think about a concept. And you could do one every day and go through, the pages of it. It's a pretty, I don't know how many are in there. It's a pretty thick book. Or you could Bible dip. You could just like
open her up
and look at whichever one comes up first. That's what I like to do because, like it feels like I'm pulling cards and that kind of stuff.
Right,
so.
like the universe is giving you what you need. One book that I love to Bible dip, and that is on my list, and anybody who knows me knows that I am 100% obsessed with Glennon Doyle, who has written a bunch of self-help books. She has a great podcast called We Can Do Hard Things. And, some episodes are better than others, right? I've listened to every single one because I'm a true Glennon believer. But Glennon wrote the book Untamed. Came out in 2020. It was a super big bestseller. I think a big kind of like, pop psych, self-helpy kind of book. But the way she writes is that they're like brief little stories. And certainly you can read it front to back. And there is like, there are some lines and some themes that carry on throughout. But I Bible dip a lot with Untamed.
Okay.
Because again, most of her chapters are like 2 to 7 pages. You can read them in a couple minutes. And it just, at least for me, like really, really resonates with my experience with the things that I struggle with. I do think women, and I think, if we're being honest, particularly the experience of like middle class white women, I think what I hear is that her stuff really, really resonates. So I would highly recommend that book for anyone who hasn't read it. So Untamed by Glennon Doyle, also good for the Bible dipping as well.
Okay.
So those are our daily ones. I guess maybe do we want to talk a little bit about dealing with like trauma, hurt, unpacking some of our shit kind of books?
Yeah.
Sure, let's get deep and sad.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I did put Codependent No More under that one.
And I think the Dodging Energy Vampires can fall under that as well.
Yes. Because it's kind of, I think when you're thinking, to me this kind of is family stuff. Maybe some trauma you've had in like intimate partner relationships, overcoming breakups, issues if you're struggling like, you know, with your children or estrangement from other family members.
Yeah.
These are kind of the books that I think are useful to help you kind of really look inside and start to unpack some of the shit that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
In that same vein of Codependent No More, I put the book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And that is by Lindsay Gibson. And that book was recommended to me. You know, somebody just said like, wow, I read this book, Jill, it like really changed my life. And I think we have to like pause here. And, you know, I do not have children, but I am a child. And I have a lot of friends with children and people that I love with children. And I think it's safe to say that we're all going to fuck up our kids in some way.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
There are certainly no parents out there that don't fuck up their kids.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah.
We're all humans. We fuck each other up.
Well, yeah. And because I think too, you know, we are all children, right? Like we've all had some type of upbringing by someone, and you know, we're human. So you know, even in, you know, the what we would consider the best, you know, caregiver relationships, we find things in there that we're like, we'll never do that to my kids. I'll never do that, right? And then sometimes the pendulum swings the other way, and so you're like, because I'm never going to do this thing, I start doing things that I think would counteract, right? And sometimes you go too far in that counteract, right?
Right.
And then, you know, then your kids are like, oh, well, I'm never going to do that, you know, because that wasn't good for me. And you know, and parenting is hard because, I mean, truly, like, we're talking about self-help books, and there are parenting books out there.
Yes.
But nobody, like, you can read all of the books and try to be prepared and, like, have all of the, like, understanding of how to keep your child alive. I mean, truly, like, keep
that is
them
step
alive,
one, keep them alive.
Make sure, you know, they're meeting developmental milestones and things like that. And, but, you know, our kids come into the world with their own soul and their own journey.
Yes.
And none of them are the same. You know, you have 3 kids and they are all extremely different. And if you're like, you know, I parented them all the same, well, you shouldn't have, you know, but maybe you didn't know that was a thing,
right.
You know, and I think that you know, we have to recognize that, you know, your parents didn't do anything, like, they probably did the best they knew how to do.
I think, yes. Very rarely in my life have I encountered a parent who was not doing the best that they could do. You know, sometimes their output, not great, right? But I still believe that their input was the best that they could do. Right. And so Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, I thought was great. One, I think it speaks to some of that codependent stuff. 2, I think for me, it helped me also recognize some of the emotionally immature behaviors I engaged in. Because, you know, we model behavior from the people around us, often our parents, sometimes other family members, sometimes friends, sometimes partners. So, I mean, I think it helped me recognize, like, okay, here are some of the things that my parents might have done, and here are some of the behaviors that I have adopted, right, in my own relationships with others. And I thought it was really great. Helped me engage in self-reflection and really just made me think about just emotionally immature behaviors in general. So I like it. And I think, you know, for people that maybe have a more complicated relationship with their parents, maybe there's not like outright or overt like abuse trauma like that, but it just feels like maybe you and your parents aren't seeing eye to eye on things now that you're an adult. I think this is a good book to help create empathy on both sides.
Oh yeah.
So highly recommend that one.
For sure. And I think I am not a great book reporter, but I believe that I did read that, and also, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was another book in that same vein, right?
Yes.
In that same vein of, you know, parents and having like if you're struggling in a relationship with your parents, like trying to unpack what that could be, right? And I felt, you know, as a parent reading those books, it was very eye-opening for me as to like, why did I do the things that I did, right? And being able to forgive yourself and to look at your parents and forgive them too, because like nobody was trying to do anything that was like malicious or anything like that. It just was what it was at the time until we knew better.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, and there is some, it speaks to some of that inherited kind of trauma that is passed through families and behaviors that are passed through families. Another book that speaks to all of that stuff as well is Emotional Inheritance by Galit Atlas. So emotional inheritance is rooted in psychodynamic theory. She's a psychodynamic clinician, or I don't know how you would say that, which is Freudian theory, for people who are not like, you know, in the field and stuff. And I am not Freud's biggest fan for a number of that we do not need to get into in the podcast. However, I do think that some of these advances in psychodynamic theory are very, very interesting. And I think emotional inheritance is good for people that do feel like there is perhaps trauma passed down through families. Yeah. And she talks a lot about her research of like families where a couple generations back people were survivors of the Holocaust, or there was like some kind of major like sexual abuse or incest going on. Or when you think about you know, like trauma passed down because of like racism and you know, living, you know, as a person of color in America. For me, it was really interesting. I have two grandparents that both lived in different parts of Europe during World War II. So my grandmother spent a couple years of her childhood in a refugee camp in Eastern Germany / Russia. And, you know, my grandfather was in Sicily and like saw his village get bombed and, you know, kind of experienced like the ravages of war, and then came to this country as immigrants, and because of that like really what I would call like significant war trauma, I thought the book was really, really interesting in looking at some of the behaviors that have manifested in that side of my family. So I think for people that maybe have just some historical trauma in their family, I thought it was very, very interesting. And from just a more academic perspective as a clinician, I thought it was cool to learn more about psychodynamic theory.
And I think that helps you understand the world and other people as well, right? Because, you know, why are you feeling that way? And we can look now and say like, oh, okay, well, this might not even be something that you directly experienced, but someone along your ancestral line did. And those stories, though you don't recognize them as direct stories, have just been passed along to where now you have this emotional response that maybe you don't even recognize anymore. Why?
And why do you have this fear? And you know, and it's interesting, and it's a little woo-woo because it talks kind of about like the trauma that we carry, right? And how trauma can often skip generations. And it talks, you know, to some of that too. And I don't know. And I think a lot of us feel like, and I think there's different reasons for this, that sometimes we feel like we come into this world carrying baggage that isn't ours, right? Is it baggage from a past life? But I think what this theory kind of says is like, no, this might be baggage of your family. You know, and how do you recognize that, work through it, and ultimately start to let it go, right? Start to kind of change some of those behaviors that you were talking about. So interesting. It's an interesting little dip, especially for our social workers out there into psychodynamic theory. Another kind of what I think we're going to see a lot of in the therapy and clinical world is we kind of see this rise of internal family systems theory, IFS. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm watching it pop up a lot more like on podcasts. I hear people talking about it. I see trainings around it that people are becoming IFS or internal family systems theory certified clinicians. And really the book that talks about IFS is No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. That was also a bestseller. I mean, it kind of hit like the psych world and the pop psych world pretty hard. And it's really interesting theory, and we probably don't need to get into it now, but essentially what it, like quick and dirty, what it talks about is we are all made up of all of these different parts that have kind of splintered and fragmented because of our life experiences, right? Because of our trauma, because of our relationships, all of those types of things. And the goal of internal family systems theory is to kind of bring all of those parts back together and get some synergy and some integration, right? Understanding that some of our maladaptive behaviors are like these parts that have splintered going off, you know, and doing them. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of old school theory in the way that psychodynamic theory is kind of old school. You know, we really saw this medical model kind of emerge around mental health. And I feel like it's swinging back a little bit towards like trauma and integration and healing and holistic kind of stuff. Right. And IFS, again, just another way to access some of that stuff that they talk about.
And I just love the way that, you know, we are finally starting to more broadly recognize that parts of our life are not good or bad. They're parts.
They're just parts. They just are.
And they serve purposes for us at different points in time. So, you know, I hate when people say, oh, that's just a maladaptive coping skill. And I'm like, no, absolutely it is not. It's an adaptive coping skill every single time, because at some point in time you develop that in order to keep yourself safe.
Yes.
And maybe we're at a point now where we can release that because we don't need that. We're out of the situation. But we have to recognize that we're out of the situation. It's that bridge over recognizing like, oh, I don't have to keep myself safe in that way anymore. Let me get out of that old pattern because it just is the old story.
Right. Exactly.
And the old story isn't bad. The old story is just the old story. And I don't have to carry it if I don't want to.
Right. And the old story worked for me. Like people pleasing is the most common example I use. People pleasing worked, right? Like if you were in a parent relationship or a romantic relationship that in order to get your safety and security needs met, you had to keep that person happy. People pleasing was important. People pleasing kept you alive.
Right.
But perhaps you are now in a space where you don't have to please other people before you please yourself.
Right.
And, you know, and you can say like, thank you, Jill, who people pleased.
Right.
You're fucking rock star. Like, you got me here. But perhaps in this new chapter that doesn't serve me. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's so funny because all these books say all the same shit. That's, you know, that's what they talk about. The last one I would put in here is Attached. And it talks about attachment theory in a super digestible way. Attached is probably, of the books that I talked about in this one, is the most like pop psyche of them all. But I think it's good. So that is by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. It's just called Attached, and it talks about the different types of attachment. So we know
it's the one with the magnet on the front.
It's got the magnets.
Yes,
like white with red.
I think I read about half of that.
I think it's good for people that maybe are struggling to find like security in romantic relationships.
Yes.
Attached is about romantic relationships. And it draws the parallel about how our childhood experiences, particularly like we're talking childhood like 0 to 4, like early childhood experience. We know, those of us, you know, that do clinical work, social worky people know that attachment is really formed in those first couple years of life. Often like those first couple months of life, right? But, you know, depending on what happens, I would say we consistently say first couple years. And people typically have one of 3 attachment styles. So they are securely attached, which means that they can form like secure and trusting attachments romantically with other people. There are people who have avoidant attachment that, exactly as it says, like who, you know, avoid that attachment. It makes them nervous. Like people getting too close feels really scary and unsafe to them. So there's often like walls and barriers put up there. And then it talks about people who are anxiously attached. So people who over-attach, who constantly fear abandonment, who worry that the attachment, it might initially appear secure, but it's just like there's a lot of anxiety around it, right? Anxious attachment. And then there are some people that have kind of like what they call disorganized attachment, which is essentially like a mixture of anxious and avoidant traits. Right. Perhaps because, there was maybe some more chaos or inconsistency in the attachment model. And this book not only talks about the different attachment styles and gives you like a quiz to figure out which one is yours, it also talks about how those like manifest in relationships. And what does it look like when an anxious and an avoidant person get together? What we learn in the book is often anxious and avoidant people go toward, like, they are attracted to each other, right? And that's where you see a lot of push-pulls in unhealthy relationships. It talks about what does an anxious with a securely attached person look like? What do two anxiously attached people look like? And it kind of gives different percentages of, like, kind of what do the array of relationships look like. Specifically, I think most of their research was done in the United States. And it's good. It helps give some good insight. It helps you kind of recognize behaviors where things might have gone wrong in romantic relationships, and it gives like some really practical tips for starting to, if you do have an anxious or an avoidant attachment style, how can you start to address some of that and work through some of that. So I like it. I think it's good. So those are kind of all the ones for trauma, hurt, loss, grief. Brianna Wiest did write a book called This Is How You Heal, which again, just more like a collection of essays and meditations, not super like clinical or based in any sort of theory, I would say there. So we could talk a little bit about anxiety, stress management, productivity. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
One book that Amber brought up that you said that you did in your 20s was the Depression and Anxiety Workbook. Tell us about that a little bit.
So that is, I mean, it is just what it says. It's a workbook, and it helps walk you through just anxiety in general. How does it manifest? What are different ways that it walks you through like the self-discovery of why do I have maybe anxiety attacks or these episodes of anxiety? Like, how am I getting there? And it helps walk you through and then unpack it. Like, go back and say, okay, where could I start to see that this is happening and intervene for myself in a way that I avoid getting all the way to the point that I'm, having some type of like physiological response to my anxiety or depression. And when I received this book, I had a therapist say, hey, work through this anxiety and depression workbook. I had been dealing with anxiety attacks for, at that point, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years. I had a whole host of medications that were prescribed to me that had side effects that led to other symptoms that led just like a whole mess. And then finally, I kind of pulled back from all that and said, this does not feel right. This is not right. And started to see a therapist and to come off of some of those medications. And what it really came down to for me was, yes, I do experience, what they would have considered at that point an anxiety disorder. That really was the basis of all of my symptomology. And so going through that workbook really helped me understand why I was having so many anxiety attacks, because, and I've heard this from a lot of people, anybody that has not had an anxiety attack or has not experienced that probably thinks that like a situation happens and you become very anxious and then you have an anxiety attack. Like it all just kind of happens together. And of course, you know where it came from because, this thing just happened. And I'm sure that does happen for some people. I don't know those people, and that is not my experience. My experience is stuff it down, and then one day you're just sitting watching TV thinking you're relaxed as hell, and your heart starts beating so fast that you're sure you're going to die, right? And you start having this anxiety attack. And then now you are having more anxiety because you're like, oh, certainly I'm going to die because my heart's beating so fast, and it's an anxiety attack, and you have just this back and forth in your head that causes more anxiety. and you're trying to calm yourself down, right? And so through doing this work in the workbook, it kind of helps you unpack, like, there were signs before that. There are things that you know that you could do to reduce that anxiety along the way so we don't get to that place. And when we get to that place, what do we do? What is our plan? How are we, talking ourselves out of this? What does our breathing look like? What does our body posture look like? Those types of things. So I found it to be extremely helpful in just, starting to unpack that for myself. Because, you can go to therapy and unpack that with the therapist, sure. But I just felt like me sitting down with myself and journaling that and because at that point in time, I was not like, I don't know. I don't feel like I trusted therapists at that point in time. Sure. Even though I was going to them, I had just had some bad experiences around therapy and medication. And it was easier to go through the workbook because I could sit there with myself. And it is a nice, very pointed way to guide you through it.
No, that's good. And I think especially for people maybe who don't have a clinical background, that I imagine there's quite a bit of like psychoeducation in that book that's telling you these are what symptoms look like. No, this isn't because there's something broken with you. This isn't because there's a physiological problem. Like, these are just symptoms of depression. These are symptoms of anxiety. Right. This is how it manifests. So.
Yeah, and I did that workbook long before I ever went to school for social work.
Exactly, yes. And I think that's a good one for people who, if they think that perhaps mood, like depression or anxiety, is causing some ongoing issues in their life, perhaps that's a good thing to work through and start with. Another book that I really recommend around more like chronic anxiety and burnout is the book called Burnout. It's called Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. And it's by Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski. And it talks a lot about, it's some more psychoeducation, and it tells us, like, why do we experience burnout? Why do we experience chronic stress and fatigue, like down to the physiological reason, right? And it talks about, essentially we encounter all of these situations throughout our days and our weeks that cause our cortisol to hit, our adrenaline to hit, and then we don't do anything to release it. Like, we get, like, we're driving to work and we're real stressed and our anxiety's high, our cortisol's high, and then we just like get to work and we sit down, right? We don't do anything physical to release, these hormones that come in stressful situations. Whereas, like, back in the day when we were like cave people, like they give the example, like a lion would chase us and like we would be terrified, right, that we're going to get eaten, but then we would run, and the running releases the hormone. Right. So they talk about how do we essentially implement daily practices that will allow us to complete the stress cycle, so we're not holding on to all of these just lingering like hormones, adrenaline, feelings, things like that. And it's good. And for people that like a little bit more like sciencey stuff, and it talks a lot about the relationship between the body and the mind when it comes to stress and burnout, it's a great book. So I would recommend that one. The other two books that I think are good, and this is where I should talk about too, we do a thing called the Third Wheel Thursday Review, where most Thursday, at least one Thursday every month or two. We try to strive for every month, but you guys know how life goes. But typically one Thursday a month, we will publish like a book review. And often the books kind of vary. A lot of them are around self-help. Some of them are more like social worky in nature. Some of them are more, like equity, racial justice kind of based. But it gives like a quick and dirty summary, a couple takeaways. If this is a topic that really interests you or feels relevant to your work, how could you dive deeper? So two of the books that we have had in the last couple of years on our Thursday Third Wheel Review are Drop the Ball, Achieve More by Doing Less by Tiffany Dufu, D-U-F-U. And then the book Resilient by Rick Hansen, which I think are just good books where we kind of, again, just examine what do our daily practices look like. Are we overwhelming ourselves? How do we build resilience? And I would just highly recommend both those books. Yep. And we have them outlined on our blog, just a little bit more information if you're interested in those. Another book that I have had recommended to me that I have not read yet, but we did have in our blog, that is 4,000 weeks, which I think is how many weeks we have in the normal life. Like in a normal lifespan, you have 4,000 weeks.
Really?
That's it.
Man.
Isn't that crazy? I think that's, or maybe it's 4,000 adult weeks. I don't really know. But anyways, the book is called 4,000 Weeks, and it's called Time Management for Mortals.
Okay.
And it's by Oliver Burkeman, and I've heard really, really good things about it. So maybe people who are struggling a little bit with, I would think, organizing their day, prioritization, right? Not getting caught up in the not important stuff, thinking about what do you really want to accomplish in this month, in this year, in this lifetime, and
Right.
how do you allocate your time and energy accordingly. I've heard really good things about it, so I thought I'd shout it out here. I think I want to give a quick shout out, and maybe this is just like selfish to me, but right now in my self-care practice, I've done like a lot of in the last couple of years kind of unpacking some of my personal like religious indoctrination and finding my own brand of spirituality and faith that really works for me. And I don't think as a millennial woman, I am alone in that journey. I think there are a lot of people that have experienced religious trauma or just, you know, maybe didn't have the most healthy relationship with organized religion or with God. And I think there's been some kind of pioneering authors, I would say, that I have had recommended to me and that I would recommend that write some books around some of that.
Right.
And the two authors that I hear a lot are Caitlin Curtis, and that's spelled Curtice. Caitlin Curtis is an Indigenous woman, but grew up kind of in the white evangelical church and is, I think, unpacking a lot of that. And I've heard her books are fantastic. I've read one of her books, but not really specifically around that. I read Native, which was really good. And it speaks a little bit to kind of her reimagining, like, who is God? You know, what does that relationship look like, you know, outside of this kind of very colonized white Jesus, right, that many of us have here in America. And then Nadia Bowles-Weber has written several books around this as well that I've had recommended to me. One book that I did want to shout out on here is Come As You Are, which is by Emily Nagoski, who wrote Burnout.
Okay.
But Come As You Are is all about sex, particularly for women. And I think for many of us, we know that like our sex education, our views on sex, the way we feel about sex can be very entangled with religion and religious indoctrination. And Come As You Are it starts out like just very scientific, like talks about like, you know, the parts of our bodies as women and men.
Right.
And just things that we were never taught, right? I don't know about a lot of people on here, but a lot of my sexual education was very rooted in religion and purity culture. And so it starts out very scientific, and then it just, you know, talks about, I think the goal and how I felt after reading it is like a much healthier view of sex, of my own sexuality. And I think it is a must read. I highly recommend Come As You Are to anyone, and particularly women.
Yeah.
Because I do think we are a bit more I think we're shamey around sex to people of all genders, number one.
Yeah.
And certainly for people who do not fit within the gender binary.
Right.
But I also think for women, particularly women that had pretty strong religious upbringings, there's a lot of shit to unpack about sex. And Come As You Are is a great tool to do that. So I did want to shout that one out here.
There's also another book around just body image in general for women. She does talk a little bit about, I guess, I don't know. If you're a man, read it. See how you feel about it. Report back. Report back as to whether or not it kind of like touched your soul the same way. But it's called The Body Is Not an Apology, and it's by Sonia Renee Taylor. And that's a really good book if you are struggling with body image. you're struggling with old stories that you're carrying along with you about your body, about what your body should look like, how it should feel, what is attractive, what is not attractive in this world, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do based on your body size, your shape, the color of your skin, your abilities with your physical abilities. It just really unpacks a lot of things, and I liked it a lot because at the end of every chapter there is some like reflection questions that she poses around body image, and just some things that you could use to kind of like journal and unpack for yourself. So very good read. And also, if you don't, I am someone who wants to listen to an audiobook in general. But I bought her book and got the audiobook because I knew that there were things in there like the prompts and things like that I would want to like be able to look at. But she reads her own book, and it's really, really good. It's really, really good.
Nice. No, that's a good one. Thank you, Amber. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, I have a bunch of books for social workers, but we have been jabbering about books for quite a while, which is, I mean, as a super nerd, I could talk about books. This is like my favorite podcast ever, all the live long day. But the last tool that I think is really cool for self-discovery and something that I've really enjoyed and that I see a lot of my colleagues using for themselves, for their teams, for their families, is the Enneagram. So the Enneagram is a personality test. It's like a very ancient personality test, and it is rooted a bit in Christianity. So I will give a trigger warning, because I think the best book, I think, to figure out what your Enneagram number is called The Road Back to You by Ian Crone and Suzanne Stabile. What I will trigger warning is that they are both pretty devout Christians. And Enneagram is rooted in Christian theology, but like ancient Christian theology before it got like weird and evangelical. But the first chapter of The Road Back to You is a little Jesus-y. I'm just going to put it out there. For me, I was like, I'm not trying to listen to all this shit, right? So I skipped the first chapter. But The Road Back to You is good, and it goes through each Enneagram number and kind of helps you identify which Enneagram is yours. So there are 9 numbers on the Enneagram. It goes 1 through 9. And Enneagram speaks to our motivations, what motivates our behavior. And the Enneagram kind of says that we are either motivated by shame, by fear, or by anger, right? That's kind of our main motivating kind of I don't know, energy, emotion, things like that. And then there's 3 numbers associated with each of those. There's also a lot in the Enneagram, like which numbers are thinkers, which numbers are feelers, which numbers are doers, which of those things are suppressed, right? I'm totally butchering this, but the Enneagram is good. And knowing your number is good.
Right.
And it helps, I think it really helps you engage in self-reflection. It helps you think about what's really, like, what are your strengths? What are some opportunities? And then there's a second book called The Path Between Us, also by Ian Crone, I think, and Suzanne Stabile. And that says, figure out what your partner's Enneagram is. Figure out what your coworkers, your kids, your parents, your siblings, because it helps give some insight on how to interact with people of other numbers. And then the final book is The Journey Towards Wholeness, and that's just by Suzanne Stabile. And that talks about, like, how do you kind of round out yourself? Like, me as an Enneagram 4, there are some things that I've got on lock. Like, I can feel every fucking feeling there ever was to feel in the world, right? I'm a good thinker. But how do I round out some of, like, translating those feelings and thoughts into actions, right? How do I verbalize some of that? How do I work through some of the challenges that come with being an Enneagram 4, right? And it really talks about kind of that rounding out and playing into the strengths of your number. So highly recommend the Enneagram for self-discovery.
Yeah. And also, so I've not read these books, but I am familiar with the Enneagram. And, like, if you just want to do, like, a little dip and be like, let me just look at this before I like get down to reading all of these
Or read
books.
600 pages.
Right. And I mean, truly, like, I just want to know my Enneagram number and have, like, a little brief overview. Like, I want the, cosmopolitan test type of a thing. There's a website called the Eclectic Energies. It's Eclectic, ECLECTIC, Energies, all one word. And there's a free Enneagram test on there. Take the long one. Don't take the short one. And it will tell you what you are. It'll tell you what number you are and what wing you are. And you can read in there. It gives nice descriptions of things. It's not going to be nearly as in-depth as this book is going to be, or these series of books are going to be. But that's just a nice way to kind of like start and look at it and see, like, does this resonate with me at all? Right?
Yes.
Because for some people, they're going to be like, no, like an Enneagram does not resonate with me. Like, I don't see myself in these ways. And maybe you need to do your self-discovery in other ways. But this is just another tool. So that's a nice website where it's free and you can, do a little Enneagram test and kind of see where you're at.
Yes, and I think, the true Enneagram gurus would be like, you can't figure out your Enneagram from a test, which we know is true. And, but I do think it's a good way to start to get an idea of like, okay, what are some of the traits that are popping out for me? And then when you get the book, or if you get the book, The Road Back to You, each chapter is a different number and it starts with a checklist. Like, if you have some of these traits, like, so for me, I didn't have to read the whole book because there's a couple of checklists I read where I'm like, this is certainly not me. Right. So I do think there is a way to kind of narrow it there as well. But yeah, and I think we should do this later on. Maybe we'll get somebody that's real versed in the Enneagram to come on and kind of talk through some of the numbers. Enneagram's cool. It just is. And it really, in my experience, facilitates self-discovery, helps us think critically about the way we're showing up in relationships, the way we're showing up in the world. I do a lot of Enneagram work with like the people I supervise and stuff like that, just because I think it's good.
Yeah.
So,
wonderful as a leader to use that on teams. I've done that before.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. And there's like a lot of like Enneagram retreats. There's a lot of, Enneagram Ashton. You can follow her on Instagram. Like there's a lot of like, people on the socials that do Enneagram work, which is cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
That was a lot of books.
Dude, that's a lot. We didn't
and
even
it wasn't even close to all of them. So
if you learn nothing else, you learn that I am a super nerd. And the good news is I own all of these books. That is one thing I wanted to say. I do think sometimes when you're doing self-helpy kind of work, having a physical book is good. I'm not a physical book kind of lady. I don't like to listen to books, but I read them all on my iPad or on my phone. Like I'm a big Kindle girl. But I do think having the self-help books is good. You can take notes, you can highlight, you can reference back to them, and you can loan them out to your friends and colleagues.
Yes.
You have a physical book that you can give somebody as a gift. So that's what I would recommend for that.
Yep.
Anything else?
I don't think so. Do we want to pull a card today?
Yeah, let's pull a card.
Okay.
Let's end with the card pull.
They're coming out of this deck because I already knew this morning.
Right,
normally I let Jill choose, but not today.
That's all right. I don't need to pick. Yeah.
This one is a little more witchy.
Maybe this will help people decide. I love a witch card. Help people decide where to start.
Yeah.
Where to go next in the journey of self-discovery.
So, this Oracle deck is called Practical Magic. And it is, we're talking about books, the actual book for the Oracle is the size of almost a novel. Like
it looks like a novel.
It is
like a little murder mystery.
Yeah. So it is definitely this is one of my newer Oracle decks. So, I invite everyone in podcast land to go ahead and take a deep breath. And release. And know that you have received exactly what you needed to receive today as you listen to this podcast.
Yes.
All right, here we go.
These are cool cards.
Yeah.
I like the color.
Yeah. They're
kind of spooky. But like spooky in a
good way. Some of them are like kind of some of them are a little dark. I will say some of them are a little dark, but we'll see what we get today. I know what I pulled this morning, and it was not dark at all. It was so wonderful.
It was so snuggly. There it is.
There she is. Oh, I got this the other day. Express your heart.
The story keeper.
The story
Jesus,
keeper.
Could it be any more
I know,
perfect?
just about. And she's holding a book. She's sitting
She is literally holding a book.
Yes, she is literally holding a book on the throne. and this one really, like, I'll kind of read you a couple things out of the book that comes along with it. But I just pulled this the other day, and this really has a lot to do with the stories that you tell yourself and the stories that you hold on to, and knowing that you sit on your own throne with your own book and you get to write your own story and pull out the old stories that no longer serve you on your journey. So what it starts out saying here, it asks you a couple questions. So these are going to be some nice prompts. What do you believe? What values mean the most to you? And who are you really when you throw off everyone else's perception of you? And when we just did an entire podcast on self-help books, and that is those are the exact questions a lot of times that we are trying to answer when we are going to, these self-help books and trying to figure out, like, what do I believe? What are my values? Who am I really down to my core? This card is asking you how honest you've been lately with yourself and with yourself and with the world. It's challenging you to go within so you are certain that what you say and do is a true expression of your soul.
Oh.
Yep.
I love it. And she looks so cool reading her book up
She
on her
is.
throne. She's like all of our listeners are going to be her. I love it.
Yes, she is definitely sitting there reading and writing her own story. So we'll take a picture of that and put it up on the social, just so you can see the deck itself, in case you are interested in getting that. And I got that at the 2nd Street Market here in Dayton at Winches of Wormwood. So I think that they still have a couple of those decks I've seen.
Nice. All right. Well, let's call it. This was a good one. We'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Guided by Third Wheel, the podcast. We would be honored if you would like, rate, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, be well.